Thank you, Leyton. Leyton just mentioned that it was our third part this year of our learning series. It's also been the third year. So my part of Greater Victoria, or representing Greater Victoria, is to recognize the work that's happened the last couple of years to get us today. So I would like to recognize Tammy Renyard, who's not here, Dave Shortreed, who always helps us with all our tech stuff and getting organized. Thank those two people to get us to our third year and the third part of our learning series. As a member of learning community in Greater Victoria, I would like to acknowledge and with gratitude that I'm a settler on the traditional territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations of which we live. Sun just came out this afternoon, so really looking forward to some learning, shared learning. Leyton, back over to you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for partnering with us and making this happen. We can't have one Maloff without another Maloff. Here comes Shelley Maloff. Excellent. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from, that I learn and I live and I research with the Silks Nation and the land here in what is now colonially called Kelowna, and how my engagement over time has deepened and grown and magnificently disrupted me to really understand my obligation to being connected to the land, to welcoming the local language, and to understanding that any act of decolonization is a step forward in more equitable and inclusive education. And so I'm grateful to be joining you today from this wonderful place that I am a guest. So here you go in the chat box, peeps. What brought you here today? What brought you here today? Maybe it was your feet. Maybe it was a curiosity in the topic. Maybe it was somebody who's sharing today. Maybe it's because you tried something or watched the previous webinar. What brought you here? Just give us a little love in the chat box. All replies welcomed and celebrated. Here come the chats. I realize this is being taped. I just remembered. Excellent, everybody. Thank you so much. Whatever brings you here is what we need right now. We need all our different interests and passions and curiosities to have an opportunity to learn together. Today's session, which is session 3 in our series, we're so fortunate to have 3 magnificent colleagues that I've had a chance to work with over the years. We're going to hear from Mehjabeen Datoo, who I've had a chance to research with and write with and debate with and teach with. We're also going to hear from Shaheen Musani, who, come on, Shaheen, way back in the day, first person I ever did a performance-based assessment with from a literacy perspective in a mathematics class in secondary. Shaheen was like, let's do this. Let's try this out. Mehjabeen is currently a PhD student at OISE at U of T and a teacher in Richmond. Shaheen is a district consultant, helping teacher in School District 38 in Richmond. And Miriam Miller, who has guested in this series last year, who's a PhD candidate and a consultant primarily in social emotional learning. There are 3 guest speakers today. And with each of the previous sessions, we're not working from a singular idea of equity, diversity, inclusion, decolonization. We welcome our guests to share the work that they're doing, and then that helps us think about the work that we're doing. And so, without further ado, I am going to pass the torch to Mehjabeen to share a few thoughts around her work, what she's been thinking about, and what that means in her context with a couple of ideas. Thanks, Mehjabeen.
Okay. And are you seeing my land acknowledgement? Yeah.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Here it comes. Yeah.
Okay. So my name is Mehjabeen. I'm just want to share where I'm teaching from, where I live, where I learn, where I've grown up for part of a lot of my life is in the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples, what we're calling Richmond right now. And here's this beautiful shot of Spanish Banks. So the territory, continues there. And I just want to acknowledge that this is where I've grown up. And when I think of home, even though I'm from so many places and born in a different place and lived in many places, this is what the land that connects with me, but this is the land that has been here for so much longer than I've been here. And hopefully it lives on through us and with us, and we continue to learn about it every day. So as we continue into this presentation, I wanted to start with a quote. So I'm coming from a bit of a post-colonial lens, not that that's so different from a decolonization lens, but it's a little bit different in the sense that where's the emphasis that I'm going to be placing. So looking both post-colonial and also a bit postmodern, kind of looking at history from a different lens. And that's what I want to kind of focus on today. And Ben Okri, he's an African writer who really inspires me. And there's this quote that I have on my wall in every classroom I've ever taught in. And it's so the lamination of it's getting like, it's back here, over here on my board. And I keep it there. And this is kind of what inspires me as a teacher. So, and this is part of the quote. So it's from his book, A Way of Being Free. You should read it, it's amazing. The worst realities of our age are manufactured realities. It is therefore our task as creative participants in the universe to redream our world. And the fact of possessing imagination means that everything can be redreamed. And although I'm not going to redream anything today for you, what I'm inviting you to do is kind of come with me on my own journey of like rethinking, making subtle shifts, okay? Looking at social studies with subtle shifts. If we change slightly how we look at it, how will that change how we teach it and organize it? And it's, so dreaming can happen, but you also have to make little changes to kind of continue that dream. So been kind of thinking about this my whole career. I entered teaching from this place of how can I do this? And I was educated at a time in the 90s at university when there was really an emphasis on disrupting kind of what was happening. And I don't know how much I think I tried, but I want us to think about the subtle ways that we can do that through this presentation. As Leyton mentioned, I'm a teacher in Richmond, also a PhD student. I don't know if that'll ever end, but I'm hoping soon. And sometimes researcher and always student, and I think also always teacher. So this presentation is going to be in two parts. It's going to be actually a lot of reflection questions that I want us to think about, or that I think about as I plan, and maybe we'll give you some ideas to think about when planning curriculum. So I'm going to take it from the planning lens. So stepping back and saying, what do I think about when I'm planning what I'm going to teach? And I'm going to focus on social studies and humanities. And I want us to kind of go back a little bit. What is influencing those choices? And then a small part of it will be then what are the possibilities? So what are some small shifts we can make in our planning that can kind of build from those reflections? So these are not answers. These are kind of things I tried. These are things I think about, and hopefully they'll give you like a framework for what to think about when you're planning. So starting just at the beginning here, looking at this question of what choices do we make when planning our curriculum? So the first choice is always like, what is our unit of study, right? What are we going to actually study? What are we going to learn about? And we have so much flexibility now to make those choices. Our curriculum is designed to give us that choice and flexibility, but I think sometimes we don't know where to start and what patterns do we also fall into? So what do we base our choices on when we make those choices? And so I would invite you to think about going beyond the notion of inclusion. So I think inclusion is really important, and it's a really important place to start, and we have to do it. I'm not at all questioning that, but I'm wondering, how do we include? I think that's the bigger question, is that how, if we, in a social studies curriculum, we could be studying different cultures, different societies. So not just looking at European history and North American history, but including other cultures. I think we all try to do that, but how do we do that? And I think that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. So what's kind of our starting point when we make these choices, when we do our planning? So there's three kind of ways we might think about it. These are some common ways. There may be other ones. So there's chronological. So if we're talking about the teaching of history, the comparative, and the idea, and starting with the big idea or essential question. And I thought each of these are perfectly fine. And there's nothing actually wrong with any of these. They all work. But when we're doing them, there's kind of hidden traps. And I want to talk a little bit about those traps. So the chronological, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do them. I'm a big believer in timelines and understanding how things happened. And you have to do that to understand cause and consequence. And that's really important. But what can we ask ourselves? Like, whose chronology? So I think most of us would be familiar with the idea that, you know, we don't want to teach just history as a story of European civilization. I think we kind of know that, and Western civilization. Want to move outside of that. So we try to include different histories, other histories. But I think either way you do it, it kind of ends up being very linear. We continue to tell the story of history as an advancement of a civilization. And we tell that story in a way, what's our underlying narrative that comes out that we may not even realize that we're communicating? And that's as if all advancement is progress. So that's the story that we end up telling, whether we realize it or not. And even if we try to include like who's been exploited in that story of progress, or if we talk about the costs of progress, which I think many of us try to do responsibly, the overall narrative is still a linear one, and it's still progressive. And so I think even that, stopping and thinking, as we're doing this chronological history, are we telling this as a story of advancement of human civilization? And is that our underlying thing? And how can we kind of play with that a little bit? And so not use a chronological approach, but to think about the underlying narrative that's coming across. So that's a question that we can ask ourselves. Then if we look at something like the comparative approach, that seems to feel like an objective approach, right? We seem to think, oh, by comparison, we're putting everybody on equal footing. And so there's a trap in there as well. The one is, what is your standard for comparison? And I think this is something that's really implicit. We don't realize we're doing it. But if we look, for example, at the grade 6 curriculum, where we're looking at governments and the development of government, and we're asking these big questions about government, we tend to still be implicitly comparing everything. Well, sometimes it's explicitly back to the Canadian model. And we do that because we want to understand our own form of government and our own system of government. And we should understand our own system of government. But are we always using Western democracy as our standard? And if we're doing that, what's the trap in there? What are we not looking at? And if we're starting with Indigenous systems, that's one way to think about it. But all the time we come back to that same model that we have. And so again, there's an underlying story that we're telling that we may not realize. So what are those kind of hidden narratives that are coming across even when we think we've disrupted those narratives? So I'm just inviting you to take 1 or 2 more steps back and look at your narratives. And I try to do that a lot. I think I don't always succeed. I fall into the traps as much as anyone else. So these are kind of my things in my head that I kind of keep and say, okay, did I do that? Am I repeating that? And I kind of try to hold those balls in the air as I do my curriculum design. And I think the other thing with the comparative is, let's not look at government, but let's look at religions. We often do comparison of religions. And what's that schema? When we do a comparison, what's our table that we compare across? What are those criteria? And where does that schema come from? Often it comes from a discipline. So it could come from, religious studies. It could come from anthropology or sociology or whatever, so history. And then as we look at each of those criteria, are they actually originally derived from a particular society standards that we have forgotten about, and now we're imposing it on other societies? So religion's a good example. We often look at beliefs and rituals and practices and scripture and all of that, but not all religions divide nicely up into those categories. And in some, actually ritual is more foregrounded, or beliefs are not actually articulated in the way we would articulate them in Western traditions. So just by using that framework, we've already that's already a problem, because we have boxed everything into these different categories that may have originally come from one discipline. So these are just some of the traps that I try to think about. And then this piece of the big idea in question, it's a great way to do it. I absolutely plan all my curriculum this way. So none of these are things that I don't think we should use. I just want us to kind of think about what's inside so we can refine it a little bit more. And so this question of what content are we choosing and why to go with the essential questions. That's what I want us to maybe think about a little bit here. So I'm going to use these examples from the Pathways textbook, the 2nd edition. And I just want to say, first of all, that this textbook has done a really great job with coming up with essential questions. So many of the questions are awesome and work really well. I just want to look at sometimes when we think the questions are really logical, what's the logic behind them? So these are 3 examples which I think we could pull out and question. And I picked them because I think they point to certain things as well. So in the chapter about India, the essential question is, what ways can a society be diverse? So it's a great question. And India is very diverse, and it's a lens through which we look at India in the entire chapter. And I've used it, and I've worked with it, and then I've thought about it and said, what did I really teach here? And yeah, it's a great big idea. And sure, we could then take that idea and look at other societies with that. But I wonder, why did we choose diversity and put that with India? Why didn't we choose diversity and put it with China? What do we think that Chinese society is not diverse? Do we understand the diversity of Chinese society? Why do we not use that for any other place that we're looking at? So why India? You know, we already have these ideas about India in our head as being very colorful, very diverse, many religions. You know, some of these things are really implicit that we don't even realize we're making connections in these questions. Then there's this chapter on Islamic civilization. And why is religion the focus? So why is that not the focus in India, or again in China, or in Europe? So there might be some reasons that we could kind of unpack a little bit. And then we look at Europe and the Middle Ages and the Vikings, and this question, do societies always deserve their reputations? So that's a great question. Why is that not in the Islamic civilization section? Or why is it not in India? Or why is it not again in China? So I ask, why this question goes with this content. And I just want to repeat, this textbook has lots of good questions and lots of ones that aren't like this, but I just want us to look at it and say, oh, did I think about this? Like, what if I put it somewhere else? What will that teach me? So this is kind of a reflection exercise and a critical reflection exercise, but I find it a little helpful, and I sometimes skip it. And if I do it and I make a unit and I think, oh, hold on a second, you know, so I just wanted to kind of share that process a little bit. And I wanted to share a little bit about textbooks themselves. There's been a little bit of research done on, a lot of research done on textbooks, and just two things I wanted to share from that research. And one of them is that if we look at the way textbooks are organized, you know, there's 1 to 2 chapters on China, maybe 3 to 4 chapters on Europe. Then there's a chapter on Islamic civilization or the Arab world, 1 chapter on India, 1 chapter on Africa. So just looking at it from that perspective, there's a disproportionality, right? So Indian history is really, really, like, we have so much information. So why is there only 1 chapter? Why is there 1 chapter on the continent of Africa? And why the Islamic civilization or the Arab world, but not the Christian world chapter? Like, we don't ask ourselves these questions, right? So these are pretty important questions to ask. Like, why do we not have a section on the Christian world? Or why do we call it Islamic civilization? And some of the answers are obvious, but you know, I think it's good to ask the question, where do these groupings come from? And many of them come from the study of history and societies that occurred in the West and came from an Orientalist lens. So that was done again in the discipline. These are the categories of the disciplines that then get carried over into social studies. So it's just something to be aware of. The other, so I was going to suggest a Pro-D activity. Okay, so if you look at these, we have a couple of new textbooks, right? So we have the New Pathways and we have the Nelson Socials textbook, which actually I think has lots going for it and kind of addresses many of these issues and the way it's designed. So really fun, I don't know if it's fun. It's fun for people like me, okay, is to go through these textbooks and look at them. And I put Patterns of Civilization because I think many of us grew up with those textbooks, okay? And I love them because I was that student who read the textbook instead of listening to the teacher. So I learned lots, okay, from that textbook. And I like it a lot. But you know, we've changed textbooks for reasons because we've started to think about these questions. And I think each of these textbooks tries to address the issues that I'm talking about and goes further in doing that. And I think that because we have become aware over the years, right, as educators about some of these traps. And I think each of them tries to deal with these traps. And what would be interesting is to go through and look at that change and say, how is each of these textbooks trying to do that? And how is it developing? And then the value of that, I think when you look at something like the Nelson textbook, it is addressing these issues. But if you're not thinking about that, it may not be explicit in your discourse with your colleagues and with yourself. You may miss some of it, or going through the process and then covering how it actually tries to deal with these traps would help you to articulate how you're doing that in your teaching. So I think just as an exercise with other colleagues or, you know, a colleague, you just kind of flip through, ask yourself some questions. How is the book organized? what are the chapters? What are the questions? How does it shift our lens from one to the other? You know, that would be really interesting. And what voices are included? How are they included? You can ask yourself these kinds of questions, and it'd be, I think, a fun exercise. The other thing about textbooks that I want to talk about a little bit is that what is the notion of history? So again, going beyond inclusion of different communities and cultures and civilizations, looking at each region as deeply complex. So we should have a whole textbook on India. We should have a whole textbook on China. You know, why are these put into sections? How do we, and more importantly than that, looking at each region as deeply complex, but also then expanding our notions of the world to see history not just as a history of different places, but always as a history of interconnected forces. Okay, that the world has always been in some way interconnected, even when it didn't feel like it was. So what is that? How do we look at history as a set of interconnected forces, and how will doing that change how we see the world? And textbooks are not actually designed that way. So that's something to think about, that we need to do as curriculum designers, right? Because the textbook's not the curriculum, we're the curriculum. So how do we start to do that and bring this out in a way? So I'm not like against textbooks or for textbooks, they're a resource. It's how we work with them that I think we need to think about. All right, so on that note, what are the small shifts that we can make? So I'm going to give you some small things that I do and talk about why. So one is I start with China. I think many people do if they want to. The new textbook, Pathways, starts with China and is an entry point for looking at the study of the development of civilization. You could look at the Silk Road to teach about trade, technology, shift in perspectives. That kind of brings many places together at one time. So you're not kind of only looking at one place. I want to talk a little bit about the unit I do on the Crusades. So rather than teaching about the medieval world in Europe as my focus, I focus on the Crusades. And what that allows me to do is to teach already about the ways people lived in different parts of the world, because Crusaders moved around and there were many places that they went to. And it focuses on the encounters between different peoples and their worldviews. So that becomes your frame rather than looking at just one group of people. And then what it also allows us to do, and why I really like to do it this way, is that, you know, the Crusades can be a challenging time to teach, because we know that there were some really problematic perspectives at play. And if we kind of look at history critically, we can see that many of the sources that were used during that time for us to even learn about it were secondhand sources from a lot of people who hadn't even gone on the Crusades. And there's more sources now available from people who were there in the cities. And so we could look at some of that. But the reason it's a problem is because we tend to demonize one group or the other, right? So for a long time, one group of people during that time, and it doesn't demonize a particular group. It allows us to situate how we see each other in history. And for me, that's the deeper understanding that I would want people to get out of what I'm teaching. And if I do this with my grade 8s, by the time I'm in grade 12 and I'm teaching them things like understanding gender, understanding race, when we're doing those kinds of topics in like social justice or in comparative cultures, we start to see how these ways of seeing each other are situated in historical processes. And I think this starts us on that journey in grade 8. And for ourselves, it helps us to think about how to situate perspectives in history. So that is a big shift. It's taking those things that I'm asking us to reflect on and bringing our students into that kind of thinking. The challenge, though, is it's not simple, and there's some work we may have to do. And some of it is that you have to interrogate the sources of information in your textbooks, okay? And you have to seek out additional sources and learn about those time periods. So this is not something you can do overnight. It's like a lifelong journey as a teacher. So, you know, it takes your time and you have to kind of think about it and learn about it. And for me, like really thinking about what are the other sources and getting other people's perspectives on these same times that we may have seen. We've grown up with certain kinds of teachings of history. So how do we start to learn about those and learn about other perspectives? So there is some work. But it's worth it if you do it. And there's some great books out there that for kids as well that kind of help us with this. Okay, and I think I just have one more slide. And the other thing we can do is ask slightly different questions. Okay, these are just slightly different questions. Okay, so here's a question: how does knowledge move across time and place and space? So again, bringing that global perspective into history right from the beginning, always looking at history as a set of historical forces. In what ways can a society be diverse? So that's the same question, but we can look at different kinds of diversity, and we can look at different places, and you can apply to any part of the world you want to study. And again, how are people and societies interconnected? So these are like my overarching questions, right? And there's slight shifts. These are the ones I use for Humanities 8 right now, because I teach social studies and English together. And so I try to talk these can actually apply to both the books we read, the other texts we study, and the history that we learn about. So really try to think about all of these bigger questions and focus on the encounter, focus on the interconnection, and focus on change rather than always the word development or advancement or progress or any of those kinds of words, right? Because change is, I think, the thing, and many things influence that. Okay, so these are just some of my big questions. I just really wanted to talk about this piece, that I have to ask myself a whole bunch of questions when I'm planning continuously, and then I have to kind of think about the questions I ask my students, and how every year I change them, and every year I think I worry again that, oh, did I do this? Did I do that? And that's just my process. And I just wanted to share that with you. And if you do want to know more about this, you can of course contact me, but I think I'm done for now.
I'm delighted to pass the torch to Shaheen. Shaheen's going to offer us some thinking that really gets us thinking about numeracy in all kinds of contexts. So yay us, and thanks, Shaheen. I'll pass the torch to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me here, inviting me to be here today to share a piece of learning that I engaged students in last year when supporting Richmond's transitional learning program, which was the platform for learning that the district offered to families who decided to learn from home. The example that I'm going to share with you today is going to be a process, an extension of thinking from Mehjabeen's part previously for designing and planning units of study while considering what your intentions for learners are. Next. So to start, I would like to thank the, To begin, I'd like to share an acknowledgement of territory as well. As a settler to this land, I'm actively working on learning more about the place on which I live and work, and to engage students in learning about those who have lived on this land before us and how we might work towards reconciliation together. I'm currently on the land of the Semiahmoo and Coast Salish peoples. I am so appreciative to be able to engage in so many fulfilling activities on this land. Please take a moment to acknowledge the territory on which you are right now, if you haven't done so already in the previous sessions. Next. So to begin our conversation, I wanted to pick up on some things that were coming out of the discussion that we had in our breakout session, where we're speaking specifically about how to engage in some challenging content with students, feeling confident and feeling like we've created a space for learning. The social studies curriculum, particularly for grades 4 to 9, addresses some very important moments in history, and it provides learners with an opportunity to develop critical thinking skills while growing their understanding of themselves, others, and the world around them. It's important to me in this work to share pieces of my identity with students, constantly considering ways that I might share the underpinnings of cultural humility in communities where we are learning and growing together. So cultural humility, just so I'm sharing my understanding of it and how I approach it with students, is more of a mindset that entails respecting others people's values and beliefs, being aware of social imbalances, and committing to lifelong learning as a process of surfacing and challenging some of our unconscious biases. stories. So we want to think about how we might come to a place of understanding of these principles and enact them while engaging in learning. And also think about how we're going to, share these principles with students and give them a platform for having conversations in safe spaces, and to share stories so that we can learn from one another. Next. So to do that initially, before engaging in any designing and learning and planning of instruction, I always try to consider what I know about my students' identities, whether it be personal or social. I want to really think about how their identities are going to inform what and how I teach, and specifically what supporting resources that I'm going to use. So I always spend the first part of the year kind of, my time with them designing learning experiences that would enable us to learn about each other through our stories. These are ways for us to begin to value the uniqueness of the individuals in our learning community. So on the slide is just a particular example of how to start a simple conversation around name. There's so much depth that goes into the creation of a name. And if there's an opportunity to have conversations at home around where your name came from and how you might share that with others in a learning community, offers opportunities for us to share stories. So this is an opportunity to learn about identity from the point of view of connection to self. In the next slide, we see connection to place. So always thinking specifically about where I'm located, how that's informing who I am, what experiences I have in the community in which I belong, what specific communities I actually, work with and believe in, and considering what my roles and responsibilities are in those places. And the next slide is really also another facet of identity that we talk about a lot before engaging in some learning about some of those very difficult and tangled relationships that exist in our social studies curriculum. So this particular slide just talks about considering worldviews and perspectives. This is something that I do with students all the time. I might bring in some conversation, invite guests to come in to share some thinking about how we might be together, be in one working place together. In this particular context, I invited an Indigenous consultant to come in to speak a little bit about the laws of relationships, the perspective from her Indigenous community. And then we had an opportunity to think about, well, how does that connect to my own beliefs and values? And what did I really like about what I'm hearing? And how might that inform my actions as I interact with everybody who's in my community? So, that's foundational learning, foundational thinking before we actually get into, thinking around units. And so this is on movement of peoples. And so my learning process or thinking process or process for planning starts with really identifying a key concept or concepts that I want to carry throughout the learning. I really start to think about dispositions, that we may want to embrace in order to make some of the curriculum tangible and to support students with making meaning. And I also really want to think about the ideas, the big ideas in the curriculum that we can make connections to. So we can either pull from the ministry's curriculum packet, or we can start to construct a big idea using some of the curricular competencies and content to build our understandings around. We consider areas of learning that might connect to some of these and identify curricular competencies that we'll be practicing. So this is where I'm going to start to bring in some literacy and some numeracy processes, and then we'll start to determine what content that will be addressed. So this is an outline of a particular unit of overview. The concept is change. In order for us to really think about change over time, and specifically as it relates to history, to help students hold on to meaning as they consider timeline of events, as they consider experiences of communities, as they consider impacts of decisions of government, we may make connections to some of our core competencies, particularly our thinking and reflective thinking and critical thinking, our personal and social awareness. We'll focus specifically on developing language around dispositions with students and talk about how empathy may help us open our minds, our hearts to learning and to hearing. And so we will also talk through experiences and hear stories where we might see stories of resilience, and therefore what might be actions that come out of this. A big idea that we could explore together is my relationship with change might help me build my resilience and empathy. And some content that we can attach to this learning through the social studies is looking specifically at urbanization and migration of peoples. We can look at equality issues, treatment of marginalized or minority populations in Canada, and we can look specifically at regional conflict. So I'm going to go through an example with you. But first, we'll specifically look at what is numeracy. So this is a definition that the ministry provides. It says numeracy is the willingness and ability to interpret and apply mathematical understandings to solve problems in complex situations. And it's the perseverance to analyze and communicate these solutions in ways that are relevant to the given context. So in this particular unit of study, we're using numeracy processes to deepen our understanding of the big idea, and particularly to connect to the concept of change. So we are embracing particular skills. We're going to learn strategies to hang our thinking on, and we're going to develop mathematical habits of the mind, which relate to the perseverance and resilience through this thinking. So this is something to think about. I'll offer you at the beginning as a way to engage in the unit first off. This particular graph comes from Statistics Canada, and it looks at population. The horizontal axis represents years of immigration, and this looks at a time period. No years are provided. Just for you to think a little bit about this without giving you a lot of context, and maybe something that I would do with students is to get them to just, connect with what they're seeing visually here. And as you are doing that, drawing on your knowledge of history, could you suggest a timeline for the years of immigration that might be represented on this graph, right? And then further, think about what those peaks and valleys might represent. Now, I'll give you an opportunity to sort of put your thoughts into the chat as I continue to speak, because we don't have a lot of time together. But this is an entry point for students in terms of thinking about how we might use data to help us deepen understandings of history. And specifically not requiring huge amount of previous experiences with interpreting and analyzing graphs. We're just looking specifically at what we might see as trends and patterns, right? What are the tops of the lines suggesting? What are the bottom lines suggesting over time? And maybe a question that I wouldn't ask students is what the timeline is here. But we bring with us, depending on our past experience, a depth of understanding around this. So a way to engage students in interacting with a graph like this, we can pull from Joe Bowler, who speaks a lot about how to connect students to data through visualization. And so this particular handout that you can supply or provide students has them thinking about what they're seeing. What are they noticing? What questions are surfacing from them? What might the graph be telling us? And what could the data be used for when they know the topic that we are studying? Next. And so this was sort of a unit flow for this unit of study on migration of peoples. Initially, we shared family stories about migration to Canada. And some students, as being Indigenous, talked about their own stories of migration within Canada. And surfaced a lot of, tensions around the experiences, surfaced so much conversation around resilience. It talked a lot about assimilation and the feeling of belonging or being excluded. We certainly had opportunities to bring in other content around push and pull factors. So what might have driven your family to move to Canada or within Canada. We also explored stories through Passages of Canada website, where students had an opportunity to hear from people of all ages about their experiences coming from all over the world. Then we explored the census of population, also poignant today. This is actually when it came out 2 years ago. And so where we all had to engage in filling out the survey, but essentially learning about what is the purpose of a survey. How does the data collected in the census going to assist us with making really important decisions for our nation? And then extending that to thinking like how can we learn about history from the data that's provided? And then we kind of centered around doing a plan a design numeracy task so that they could get a sense of what is a process for problem solving. Then we looked at bringing in some literacy skills by pulling some infographics from Statistics Canada. We could specifically look at how do we read infographics for information. And then to critique what we see. So how are we analyzing the infographics to determine what the purpose of the infographic is and what values it might show us? So here we looked at population growth due to immigration. We explored national classification system for immigrants. And then we looked specifically at determining the national goals connected to immigration. And then finally, as a means for pulling some of this learning together, we thought, okay, we're studying so much data coming from our nation. Let's create data within our own learning community around the same topics. So we shared a survey tool that had them sharing similar facets of their identity. And then did some comparison with our national representations and had a conversation about what does that tell us and why, and some deeper learning about urbanization. We made connections specifically to address those differences, and then segued later into deeper learning about government policy around immigration and some of the actions that have then come out of that. So what's coming next for you is just some examples. The student example on the side is blurry. I'm sorry about that. I couldn't find another one. But what you see on the left is just a template to help students structure conversations. We're inviting students to have conversations with their families. This was a huge learning process for me when I was, in my early teens, actually, and wanting to learn a lot about what my family story was. For often, it was preserved. And although it was an identity marker for them and had so much influence and impact on, who I became, it was sort of, hidden truth. And so, if we could surface those stories, within conversations in the home and bring them into into the classroom, the idea is how much learning that we could share from each other, right? So we talked about push-pull factors, you know, what was the story of their journey, what might have, you know, been some challenges along the journey, and then, you know, connections to other people's stories that they might have read. And then this is an example of the, you know, how they might have interacted specifically with the census. We gave them an opportunity to look through the questions and do some thinking around what questions they were seeing. We categorized based on, you know, what do we think that this information is pertinent for? How would that information inform these parts of decision-making processes in government? And then at the bottom, what we see is an opportunity to engage in a numeracy task, right? Where we're going through an entire process of numeracy. We're starting to interpret the problem. We are applying some of our, you know, mathematical knowledge to determine what concepts that we might apply to find a solution to this problem. So that was a plan and design task. And then here's an example of an infographic that also comes from Statistics Canada. We gave, you know, and practiced a strategy for reading this information. And then while reading this information, there's so much data in here. So at the same time, we could practice some of our, you know, mathematical competencies. We could look at fractions. We could specifically look at graphing. We could look at language. So some of this language is quite inaccessible. And so how do we break it down for students? We used anchor charts. We thought about what are some relevant and current ways of describing people as they migrate from one place to another, what language is appropriate in doing so. And then in the next slide, you'll see another one where we learned more about the value system around that. Okay, maybe I didn't put it, but we then questioned sort of Canada's value system around type of immigrants that that our government is currently sort of supporting through that process. And so we collected data, as I was saying, from our learning community. So this is, we had 219 people out of maybe 500 participate who offered us some data around why their families immigrated to or migrated to Canada. And then we, you know, represented some of that thinking. They had to go away and represent it in other ways. We talked specifically about, okay, what's the conversation here? What are we noticing are similarities and differences in the data? On the right, you can see that that is a graph from Statistics Canada. It's actually a live graph so that you can click on it and look at specific regions of each of these continents to gain some more information. And so on the next slide, this is how they showed some of their thinking. Right, similarities, differences, what might be the reason for that? And then coming back together and saying, okay, what further questions do we have about this? And where is our investigation going to take us? So you can see in this unit of study that you do over a period of time, we're engaging students in a number of skills and competencies, but we're specifically using numeracy to help us deepen our understanding of big ideas. So I have a few questions for you here, right? What are the competencies practiced? What content did we address? How might this learning create a bridge for further learning about past discriminatory government policies and actions and human rights and responses to discrimination? How might the learning in this unit cultivate deep conversations around challenging topics while allowing students to grow their core competencies? So at this, at the end of this, having just a thought about thinking about how do we bring this back to students having an opportunity to reflect on their learning, right? To say, this is what I knew, this is what I know now, this is some action I'm going to take as I move forward. Obviously, conversations that we continue to have as we started to explore some of Canada's historical wrongs. And that is it for me.
I'd like to welcome friend of webinar, Miriam, like friend of podcast. Miriam, thanks again for coming back this year and thinking with us and also helping us move our thinking forward and maybe disrupting our thinking a little bit around social emotional learning. Thanks, Miriam.
Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. It's so good to be here and to be part of this incredible crew. This team is really remarkable, and it's such an honor to be able to be a part of it and to learn alongside with all of you. Folks, just by way of welcoming each and all into this space, I invite you just to take a moment and pop in the chat, because we're going to transition into a kind of another area of our minds as we explore SEL. If you could take me somewhere to help me understand who you are, where would you take me? Just as a little way of transitioning into this next little bit of time. And by way of engaging in an SEL signature practice, a welcoming ritual. Amazing. So folks, for the next just short amount of time, we're going to explore equity, diversity, inclusion, and SEL. Feels like everyone is talking about this type of work, and it feels like, oh, here's some white lady who's going to talk to us about, fitting all of this together. And so I feel a little nervous. I feel a little uncomfortable. Like, what can we talk about that will be meaningful in a short amount of time? What can we talk about that won't reduce all of these things to simple kind of strategies? So instead of, sharing loads of different strategies or different ideas, we're going to follow a little bit of an hourglass in our time. So Mej started us out with some pretty broad ideas around unit planning and really thinking about how we might problematize textbooks and knowledge. And Shaheen brought us into a more narrow focus of this interdisciplinary numeracy example. And I'm going to broaden it back out to have us explore this field of SEL. So pretty broad idea. And really, I'm just going to share some of the things I've been wondering about, some of the things that are on my heart and in my mind right now. And just before we dive into that, I will also share that I am joining in on this call from the traditional, ancestral, unceded land of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples. And I share this acknowledgement not as an act of decolonization per se, but really as a way of recognizing that I live and I teach and I learn and I play on this land that is colonized, that has a legacy of colonization. And so as I grapple with that and as I think about this legacy of colonization, it brings me to wonder, what is my own history of colonization and what is my current act in that work? And so just by way of naming sort of this wondering, my great, great, great grandmother was a botanist, a scientist, and also an author who wrote several books about exploring the backwoods of Canada. And so while this was like a family, point of pride, when I was pushed to think about, who am I and where am I from, I started to grapple with this history that I have of being a pioneer, coming from a pioneering family in Canada, and wondering, what is that legacy that my family has here in this place? And even in the words that my great 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 grandmother used about, discovering plants that no other human hand had seen or touched before. draws my attention to how much the white experience was centered here in this work and in their learning, in her learning. And as I think about, what else brings me into this place, I invite you to think about what brings you here. What is the history that brings you to this place? And maybe what's the legacy you'll be leaving as you move forward in time. With this in mind, this idea of colonization and legacy, I've had the opportunity of working with many places and many different people in the area of SEL. And not so long ago, I worked on a large project in Los Angeles Public School District, Unified Public School District. And we were exploring ways that we might make SEL more equitable and more accessible and what that meant. And there I was, a Canadian researcher kind of parachuting in to schools. And I realized that maybe this idea of, bringing SEL to places was also problematic, right? And so I started to really wonder, how does SEL continue to perpetuate colonization, exclusion, inequity, and racism? Now, I think at the very end of your time, you probably want some sort of like optimistic, happy-go-lucky, here's SEL, yay, we're done. And I'm like going to bring us to this kind of finish, hopefully not too much. But I wanted to share some of the questions that I've been really grappling with. We all know that SEL is this like beautiful, shiny thing, this idea of building skills and competencies in ourselves and in the children and youth with whom we work, so that they might be, well-rounded, holistic individuals, so they're ready for success in the world. That's kind of how it's been framed. And I've worked at this field for more than a dozen years, and I love SEL. I feel like I live, eat, breathe, drink, sleep, dream SEL. And yet I've been wrestling with this idea for quite a while of like, what's the problem? What's going on with SEL here? Much like Mej has some questions around textbook selection, knowledge generation. And so let's apply a little lens of criticality, borrowing from Goldie Muhammad's work. So criticality is a capacity and ability to read, write, think, speak in ways to understand power and equity in order to understand and promote anti-oppression. So when we think about SEL, how does this connect? How can we bring a critical lens, a lens of criticality to the field? What are the ways that we can humanize SEL, not just decolonize SEL, but what are the things that we can do to humanize SEL? How do we connect teaching SEL to the shared human condition? How might we teach SEL in ways that are responsive to the current socio-political context? How does SEL and our instruction of SEL help us to understand power, equity, and anti-oppression? Because if we're teaching skills like conflict resolution, but we're not actually talking about systemic conflict or systemic harm, what's the point in this work? What is our point, really? And that's kind of what I'm wondering for many of us. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to study loads and loads of popular education articles about SEL. And I did a narrative analysis, and I discovered sort of the story of SEL. And at the time, SEL was called the missing piece in education. Like, whew, we focused so much on these cognitive skills, but now we have an opportunity to build in some soft skills. And this is the missing piece. And SEL was this opportunity to build student skills for success, whatever that meant. SEL was an opportunity to close the performance gap of Black and Brown children with other white students. And really what came out in the narrative, as I was looking across hundreds of articles, was that there was this metaphor that SEL was like a savior or hero figure in education. And I don't know about you, but that doesn't sit very well with me, and really maybe causes us to wonder, well, like, what's going on here? And maybe how can we do this in a different way? And I think that's what the field has actually been grappling with for quite some time. And so some questions maybe we might think about is like, who determined which social and emotional competencies are important? And what are they important for? The definition of SEL is actually skills and competencies that support success in life. But what does that mean? Who decided what success was? Whose lived experiences are centered when we think about SEL? And how might SEL be problematic and racist? So lots of questions. And so when we think about this, and if we look across some of the literature that's out right now, we can see many folks are applying this lens of criticality. So what we know is that SEL standards are rooted in white, Eurocentric norms and continue to center whiteness. And I think about this when I think about how we talk about appropriate emotion expression. Who decided which emotions are appropriate for which context? Those are socially constructed norms. Who's constructing them? And then how are we conforming to them? SEL can be about compliance. I've worked with lots of educators who ask me to provide them with support, some strategies to help regulate their students so the students can be, doing the things they need to do. Sometimes we think about SEL as behavior management, right? We want the students to sound and respond and act in the same way. SEL, unfortunately, can be used as a form of policing to punish BIPOC children and communities and kind of force them to adhere to white norms. Sometimes we call this classroom management. Sometimes when I'm working with educators, I hear about how SEL skills are necessary for some children, particularly Black and Brown children, and in our context in Canada, often for Indigenous children. But at the same time, they're seen as career readiness skills or skills for success for other students, often white students from more advantaged situations. So sometimes we hear like, those kids really need SEL skills. And as my dear friend and colleague says in very bold words, without context, SEL risks becoming white supremacy with a hug. It's like, folks, I just want to say, I generally love to be liked and I love to say nice things about all kinds of fun things we can do in our classroom. And I feel like this is not that moment, right? Where we're naming some rather bold and uncomfortable claims, but I think they're worth maybe provoking us or nudging our thinking a little bit. Maybe in the chat, feel free to share. What is your response to this so far? Where have you seen SEL as problematic? How does this sit with you? Where do you notice maybe some defense coming up? If you're welcome or if you're comfortable, please do share. So I think right now there's an invitation for us to start problematizing SEL skills and to move beyond just what we've been given to think about what we might create. So if we think about self-awareness as a potential starting point for some of this work, we can start to wonder like, what's missing within this definition? What other skills might we want to include or foster? And in one particular school I worked with, a team sat down and said, hey, we're actually not satisfied with the skills that we're naming as SEL skills. We want to redefine this. And so they came up with some wonderings. They wondered, what if self-awareness went beyond building a positive sense of self-identity to include building a positive racial identity so that children of color can thrive, even when that identity is undervalued or mistreated by society. And so that white children can understand a positive way of being white while also understanding the harm of white privilege. Like, this is from an elementary school. Well, it's a pretty big wondering, right? And that's what they're seeking to unpack with their students as they explore how to actually make SEL responsive to their context. That it's not enough just to take and kind of put in and plug in place, but to be critical minded of what this means and how we might go about this. So how might we reimagine SEL? In just 2 minutes. So there are so many, access points out there. I'll just mention a couple of things. We know that we're moving away from programmatic, top-down SEL approaches, right? That we're trying to look at SEL as a way of being, a way to approach teaching and learning that is community generated, that happens within a community, And that really leverages that sense of the funds of knowledge that everyone brings, right? Believing that every person has gifts and is a gift. We know that SEL is relational. And so knowing our students, just like Shaheen said, understanding, where our students are from, maybe if they share their name story, that builds that relational component. And the SEL is dynamic. There's now a field called Transformative Sel. And the whole purpose of this is really to look at the way that SEL can be used as an entry point to explore aspects of social justice as we critique power, right? So building our understanding of self and others, understanding of systems, having that social awareness, so that way we can make sense of ourselves and others within our current context. And those are the skills that we really want to build with our students. So when we think about what does this mean in practice, I'm going to just drop a couple of quick suggestions really quickly. The pat response that everyone seems to go to in the field right now is to say, well, we'll start with self-awareness, right? Because this is the foundation of equity. And I agree a little bit, but I think maybe we could also apply a lens of criticality here. I don't know if the self is always the place we want to start. It becomes really egocentric. However, most of us are doing some really beautiful work, identity-related work. But I think part of how we can maybe shift this idea of starting with self-awareness is really more thinking about how we plan our instruction. So how will my instruction of anything, not just like an identity unit or learning about ourselves unit, but how will my instruction help students learn something about themselves or about others? And how might I, and the way that I teach and the way I create my learning environment, how can I focus on the beauty and brilliance of the youth in my class? What might that actually look like? And so I'm going to wrap up with just a quick little story, because if we look away from ourselves and we think more about some principles that are more about the community. If you've heard me share before, I often talk about SEL as first starting with co-creating community agreements. And they often look something like this, right? How do we want to feel while we're together? How will we help each other and ourselves experience these feelings? And so I like to think of this as like a beautiful way of bringing in all voices into a classroom and setting up norms for behavior. And when I was working with a group recently, they answered those first two questions. And it's beautiful what they came up with. And this is quite common, right? These responses. And they talked about, what would this look like in our context, right? So, what does it look like to be safe and what will we do? And this was lovely, right? We all felt good about it. We were like, oh, look at us. It was amazing. And then we had some fraught, emotionally charged conversations, because we were also exploring aspects of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And what was happening in those conversations was that some of the students who were institutionally and historically marginalized became the example of our learning, that they were pushed even further to the margins so that the dominant culture of the class could learn from them, which was completely inappropriate and caused more harm. And so in this example, we had some disagreements, and the loudest voices were like pushing their agenda, right? And playing devil's advocate when really we know the devil doesn't need any advocates, right? And so within this framework, we had these beautiful agreements, and yet so much harm was happening in our conversations. And so I just want to leave you with this notion of like, we talk about cultivating safe spaces, and now folks are talking about brave spaces. But even within these so-called safe and brave spaces, how do we know that we can encourage folks to not cause harm? Not even just encourage. How do we prevent harm from happening in our classrooms when we're, having emotionally charged conversations? What would that look like? And so my suggestion in 30 seconds, Leyton, is this idea of creating principled spaces where we name, like, yes, we want to, feel all of these these beautiful things, and what will happen when things go wrong? How do we course correct? How do we handle those uncomfortable feelings? How do we prevent harm from happening? And how do we ensure that we're really building relationships? And so I'm going to just leave you with a couple of examples of having some working assumptions that when this happened in my own class and context, I shared my working assumptions and I said, we're going to have some bottom lines. So we're going to stop a conversation if it goes off the rails, because even though we say we want to feel safe, we know that we cannot guarantee the safety of everyone. Folks, I have to stop talking. I have to turn it over to Leyton. And I have so much to say. So let's get together another time and have a chat. In the meantime, shameless plug, take a look at Liberate Ed, incredible resources that center racial justice healing and collective humanity within SEL. But I'll just stop now. Over to you, Leyton. Sorry for the quick finish.
Thank you, Miriam. Just what we needed. Sometimes we don't know what we need until we get it. Folks, thank you for finding time in what is, I don't even have words for it, people, but I can't use swear words because it's being recorded right now. But people, it's a tough time right now. And yet when we come together and we support each other, we get energy. And so thinking about disrupting what we do is really powerful, but also thinking about we're already taking steps in the right direction and having some time to share. I saw it in the chat box, in the breakout groups. There's not a way, but there are many ways that we can make space for more community, thinking about how we work together to recognize power in our spaces, but more importantly, that when we learn to celebrate difference and plurality, we're going to move forward in really powerful ways.